Blood dripped from Sophie's small hand onto pristine snow as she trudged forward through the howling blizzard. Each step became a battle against nature's fury, the wind slashing at her thin nightgown like invisible knives. At 7 years old, Sophie Evans knew what it meant to fight for survival. Cradled against her chest, 6-month-old Henry whimpered weakly, his fevered body the only warmth in her frozen world. "Just a little farther, Henry," she whispered, her cracked lips barely moving in the biting cold. "I promise I won't let you die. I promise, Dad." The temperature had plummeted to 15 below zero. Sophie's medical knowledge, gleaned from countless nights caring for her brother, told her Henry had perhaps 20 minutes before hypothermia claimed him. Her own feet, bare and bleeding from jagged ice hidden beneath the snow, had lost all feeling. Still, she pressed forward, each footstep a testament to her desperate determination. Through the curtain of swirling white, lights appeared, distant golden beacons cutting through the darkness. A massive structure loomed ahead, a mountain of stone and glass perched on the Colorado mountainside. Sophie had heard whispers about the mansion and its reclusive owner. Now it represented their only hope. Miles away from the nearest neighbor, the elegant estate overlooked a frozen lake, its reflection distorted by the storm's violence. Inside, James Mitchell sat alone in his cavernous living room, the crackling fireplace casting long shadows across imported marble floors. At 52, the CEO of Mitchell Technologies had amassed a fortune that placed him among America's elite. Tonight, that fortune provided him perfect isolation. James swirled 30-year-old scotch in a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching the firelight. His weathered face, once handsome in a conventional way, had hardened over years of boardroom battles and personal loss. Silver temples framed deep-set eyes that had seen too much, and somehow not enough of what truly mattered. His gaze drifted to the photograph on the mantel. Catherine smiled back at him, forever 39, forever beautiful. Their daughter Emma, forever 12. 5 years had passed since the car accident. 5 years since he'd chosen an emergency board meeting over the family vacation. 5 years of living with the knowledge that had he been driving instead of Catherine, they might still be alive. The wind howled, rattling the reinforced windows. James welcomed the sound. It matched the storm that had never ceased within him. A noise interrupted his dark reflections, so faint he might have imagined it. Then it came again. 3 soft taps at his front door. James frowned. No one should be outside in this weather. His security system would have alerted him to any vehicle approaching the property. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles down the treacherous mountain road. The tapping came again, weaker this time. James set down his glass and moved through the silent house. The imported grandfather clock showed just past midnight as he crossed the marble foyer. The storm's voice grew louder as he approached the massive oak doors. His hand hesitated on the handle. In 5 years, he had perfected the art of shutting out the world. Opening this door felt like a betrayal of that careful isolation. Another tap, barely audible above the wind. James unlocked the door and pulled it open. Arctic air rushed into the warm foyer, carrying swirling snow across imported tile. At first, he saw nothing but darkness and the violent dance of snowflakes in the security lights. Then he lowered his gaze. A child stood on his doorstep, her thin frame nearly lost in the storm. Snow crusted her blonde hair and eyelashes. Her nightgown, woefully inadequate against the elements, whipped around skinny legs. Blood had frozen in crimson trails from her bare feet to the snow below. In her arms, she clutched a small bundle wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Her eyes, startlingly blue and filled with a determination no child should possess, met his. For a suspended moment, neither spoke. Then the bundle in her arms made a sound, the weak cry of an infant in distress. "Please," the girl whispered, her voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "Just one night. My brother will die if we stay out here." Before James could respond, the girl's eyes rolled back. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed forward. James moved with a speed that surprised him, catching both children before they hit the ground. The infant wailed weakly as James lifted them into his arms, feeling the dangerous coldness of the girl's skin against his. In that moment, James Mitchell faced a choice that would alter the course of 3 lives forever. He could call the authorities, pass responsibility to those whose job it was to handle such matters. The rational decision, the safe decision. Instead, he looked down at the unconscious child and the fevered infant in his arms and felt something stir within him, a protective instinct he thought had died along with his family. "I couldn't save them," he whispered. "I won't let anyone else die on my watch." James carried the children inside, kicking the door closed against the raging storm. The girl, Sophie, he would soon learn, regained consciousness as James placed her on the leather sofa nearest the fireplace. Her first action was to reach frantically for the bundle he had carefully set beside her. "Henry!" she gasped, pulling her brother close, checking his breathing with practiced movements. Only when satisfied did she acknowledge her surroundings, eyes widening at the luxury that surrounded them. "You're safe now," James said, his deep voice gentler than it had been in years. "Both of you." Sophie's wariness remained palpable. She held Henry with the fierceness of someone who expected him to be taken away at any moment. James recognized the look. He'd seen it in business opponents backed into corners, in wounded animals prepared to fight despite impossible odds. "I need to check your feet," he said, gesturing to the blood staining his imported carpet. "And your brother needs medical attention." Sophie tightened her grip on Henry. "He just needs to get warm. He'll be okay." James knelt to her eye level, moving slowly. "I won't separate you, I promise." Sophie studied his face with an intensity that felt like judgment. Whatever she sought, she seemed to find it, for she nodded once, a gesture too adult for her young face. As James cleaned and bandaged Sophie's feet, he noticed other marks, bruises in various stages of healing along her arms, a partially healed cigarette burn near her collarbone. The discovery ignited something dangerous in him, something he hadn't felt since those first dark days after losing his family. "Who did this to you?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral, despite the rage building inside. Sophie's eyes darted to the door, then back to Henry. "I fell." The classic response. James had heard it from Catherine during their early dating days, when she'd try to explain away her father's abuse. The memory stoked his anger further. "Your brother has a high fever," James said instead of pressing. "He needs medication, proper care. No hospitals." Sophie's voice sharpened with fear. "She'll find us. She always does." "Who will find you?" Sophie remained silent, her small hand smoothing Henry's thin hair with tender care. "I need to know who I'm protecting you from," James tried again. Sophie looked up, something breaking in her careful composure. "Our stepmother, Victoria. Since Dad died, she changed. She hates us. Says we're just in her way." James nodded, making a mental note of the name. "How long has your father been gone?" 8 months, 12 days." The precision of her answer spoke volumes about the impact of the loss. "And your mother?" "She died when I was 4, when Henry was born." Sophie's voice flattened, reciting facts rather than expressing emotion. "Dad married Victoria last year. She was nice then." As James prepared warm milk for Henry and soup for Sophie, the girl revealed more in broken pieces. Gregory Evans, their father, a successful investment banker. The sudden marriage to Victoria, a beautiful woman 20 years his junior. His unexpected death in a car accident that Sophie described with suspicious details. The gradual transformation of their home into a place of fear. "She makes me take care of Henry all by myself. Says if he cries, it's my fault." Sophie spoke while feeding her brother with practiced efficiency. "Tonight he got really sick. He couldn't stop coughing. I asked Victoria for medicine, for money to buy some." Sophie's voice caught. "She said Henry was too much trouble, that she'd never wanted children anyway. When I begged her, she pushed us out the door. Said the cold might teach us some gratitude." James felt his hands tighten around the mug he held. In 30 years of business, he had encountered countless unethical people. None disgusted him as much as this unknown woman who would condemn children to die in a blizzard. "I carried Henry for miles," Sophie continued, her young voice steady despite the horror of her words. "I saw your lights through the trees. I didn't know if anyone would be home, but I had to try." James watched as Sophie tended to her brother with the competence of a seasoned caregiver. No 7-year-old should possess such skills, born from necessity rather than choice. His mind raced with implications, with next steps, with the complexity of what helping these children might entail. Henry's condition worsened as the night progressed. His small chest worked too hard for each breath, his fever climbing despite the children's medicine James found in his bathroom cabinet. Sophie refused to sleep, keeping constant vigil over her brother, whispering reassurances when he stirred. By 3 in the morning, Henry's breathing had developed an alarming rattle. Sophie's composure finally cracked. "Something's wrong," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's never been this sick before." James checked the infant's temperature again. 104.2 degrees. Dangerously high for one so young. We need to get him to a hospital, James said firmly, already gathering blankets. Panic flashed across Sophie's face. No, they'll take him away from me. They'll send us back to her. They won't, James promised, though he had no right to do so. I won't let that happen. Sophie shook her head vehemently. Everyone says that. The teachers, the neighbors, they all promise to help. But then Victoria talks to them, and they believe her instead of us. She shows them pictures of us smiling. She tells them I make up stories. The familiar pattern of abuse and its concealment. James recognized it all too well. Sophie, James said, kneeling before her. Look at me. Her blue eyes, too old for her young face, met his. I am not everyone. I am James Mitchell. I've built an empire by keeping my promises and destroying those who stand in my way. He spoke with the quiet certainty that had cowed boardrooms of powerful men. If I say I will protect you and Henry, then that is exactly what I will do. Something in his tone reached her. Sophie studied him again with that unnerving intensity, then nodded once. Okay, she whispered. The storm had intensified, transforming the mountain road into a treacherous gauntlet of ice and snow. James carried Henry to his customized Range Rover, the infant bundled in thick blankets. Sophie refused to be carried despite her injured feet, limping determinedly beside him. As James navigated the perilous descent toward Aspen Valley Hospital, Sophie sat in the back seat with Henry cradled against her. Her eyes remained fixed on her brother, her small hand constantly checking his breathing, his temperature. Have you always taken care of him? James asked, partly to keep her engaged, partly out of genuine curiosity about this remarkable child. Since he was born, Sophie replied, her voice soft but clear over the howl of the wind outside. Mom died right after. Dad tried, but he worked a lot. Then Victoria came, and it was just better if I did it. James caught her eye in the rearview mirror. That's a lot of responsibility for someone your age. Sophie shrugged, a painfully adult gesture. Henry needs me. Dad said I was the strongest person he knew. He made me promise to protect Henry no matter what. Right before he died? Sophie's gaze dropped to her brother. He knew something bad was going to happen. He started putting papers in a special box, telling me where to find things if something happened to him. Victoria didn't know. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The night before his accident, he told me, Sophie, remember that no matter what happens, you and Henry are the most important things in my life. Promise me you'll always protect each other. The implications weren't lost on James. Gregory Evans had feared for his life. What happened to those papers? James asked carefully. I have some in my backpack, the important ones. Victoria found the box, but I took some papers first. Pride flickered briefly across her young face. She never knew. The conversation paused as they reached a particularly dangerous curve. James focused on the treacherous road, hands steady on the wheel despite the vehicle's tendency to slide on hidden ice. The stakes of this journey had just increased exponentially. They'll ask questions at the hospital, Sophie said suddenly, fear edging her voice. About who you are, about our injuries. Let them ask, James replied. I have considerable influence in this community. We'll tell them I'm your uncle, visiting from out of town. That I found you in this condition and I'm getting you help. Sophie considered this. But what if Victoria comes? Then she'll deal with me. The coldness in his voice made Sophie look up sharply. For the first time since arriving at his door, Sophie's lips curved in the ghost of a smile. You're not afraid of her? James met her gaze in the mirror again. Sophie, I've faced down corporations worth billions and governments of world powers. I don't scare easily. Victoria can make people believe her, Sophie warned. She makes them think she's perfect. I've spent my life seeing through perfect facades. James navigated another treacherous curve. It's how I built my company, recognizing what's real and what's fabricated. Sophie fell silent, absorbing his words. After a moment, she whispered, Thank you for helping us. Something shifted in James's chest, an unfamiliar warmth in a place long cold. You don't need to thank me for basic human decency. Most people don't bother with that either, Sophie replied, her young voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. The statement, delivered with such simple conviction, struck James deeply. What world had this child been living in, where basic compassion was remarkable? A world not so different from the cutthroat business environment he'd thrived in, perhaps. The thought disturbed him. Henry's condition deteriorated further during the treacherous hour-long journey. His breathing became increasingly labored. his small face flushed with fever. Sophie's calm efficiency gave way to quiet panic, her whispered reassurances to Henry becoming desperate prayers. When they finally reached Aspen Valley Hospital's emergency entrance, James didn't wait for attendance. He lifted Henry himself, rushing through automatic doors with Sophie limping urgently beside him. "This infant needs immediate attention," he announced with the authoritative tone that had built his reputation. "Respiratory distress, high fever, possible pneumonia." The staff responded instantly to both his commanding presence and the obvious distress of the baby. A doctor and two nurses appeared, taking Henry from his arms while asking rapid-fire questions about symptoms and duration. Sophie refused to be separated from her brother, her earlier wariness returning tenfold in the clinical environment. Only James's firm hand on her shoulder kept her from interfering as the medical team assessed Henry. "They're helping him," James assured her quietly. "That's all that matters right now." While the medical team worked, a nurse approached with forms and more questions. James smoothly assumed the role of concerned uncle, providing vague but plausible explanations for his sudden appearance in the children's lives. When asked for identification and insurance information, he produced his wallet, the Mitchell name opening doors as it always had. Dr. Martinez, a pediatrician called down to examine Henry, frowned as he listened to the infant's chest. "Severe respiratory infection exacerbated by exposure and what appears to be underlying malnourishment," he reported, his experienced hands gentle on Henry's tiny form. "We need to start antibiotics immediately, along with fluids and breathing treatments. He'll require admission." Sophie's face crumpled at the word admission, her small body tensing as if preparing to grab her brother and flee. James placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Will he recover completely?" James asked. Dr. Martinez's expression softened as he glanced at Sophie's obvious distress. "With proper treatment, yes. He's very ill, but we've caught it in time." He knelt to Sophie's level. "You did the right thing getting him here. You may have saved his life." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Can I stay with him?" "Of course," the doctor assured her. "We don't separate families here." As Henry was prepared for admission, a new figure approached. A woman in her 40s with a hospital badge identifying her as Patricia Green, Social Services. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, her tone professional, but with an underlying skepticism. "I understand you're claiming to be these children's uncle." James straightened to his full imposing height. "I am James Mitchell. These children are my responsibility now." Patricia's expression didn't waver. "I see. And do you have documentation supporting this guardianship?" "The situation developed rapidly," James replied smoothly. "Their father was my wife's brother. When I discovered their circumstances, I acted immediately to ensure their safety." "And where have they been living previously?" Before James could answer, Sophie spoke up, her voice small but steady. "With our stepmother, Victoria Evans. She doesn't want us. She pushed us out in the snow tonight because Henry was sick." Patricia's professional demeanor softened slightly as she turned to Sophie. "That's a very serious accusation, sweetheart." "It's the truth," Sophie insisted. "She hurt us. Look." She pulled up her sleeve to reveal the constellation of bruises James had noticed earlier. Patricia's expression tightened. She glanced at James, professional suspicion returning. "I'll need to document these injuries." "Of course," James agreed readily. "Document everything. I want a complete record of what these children have endured." His willing cooperation seemed to surprise the social worker. She studied him more carefully. "Mr. Mitchell, this is highly irregular. There are procedures for reporting suspected abuse, for temporary guardianship." "Ms. Green," James interrupted, his voice low but carrying the authority that had built his business empire. "I understand your concern, but these children came to me in desperate need in the middle of a life-threatening storm. The priority was getting them medical attention. Now that we've accomplished that, I'm happy to comply with whatever paperwork you require." Patricia seemed to reassess him. "We'll need to investigate the children's home situation and verify your relationship." "I would expect nothing less," James replied. "In the meantime, I assume the children can remain in my care while Henry receives treatment." "That's not typically how—" "Ms. Green," James cut in again, his tone pleasant but unyielding. "Given the allegations of abuse and the children's clear distress, surely returning them to their stepmother immediately would be premature. I have the resources to ensure they receive the best care while your investigation proceeds." Patricia hesitated, clearly weighing options. "I'll need to consult with my supervisor." "Of course," James smiled slightly. "I should mention that I'm on the hospital's board of directors, Perhaps we could use the conference room for this discussion. I'm sure Dr. Abernathy would be happy to join us. The carefully placed name drop had its intended effect. Patricia's expression shifted subtly. Let me make some calls. As she stepped away, Sophie looked up at James with newfound respect. You're important here. James shook his head. Influence is just a tool, Sophie. What matters is how you use it. While Henry was settled into the pediatric ward, James and Patricia engaged in a careful negotiation about the children's immediate future. James leveraged every connection, every ounce of his considerable influence, to ensure the siblings would remain together under his protection. The delicate discussion was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. A woman's voice, pitched to carry distress while remaining socially acceptable, rose above the hospital's quiet hum. My children! Where are my children? Someone called about Henry being admitted. Sophie, who had been sitting quietly beside Henry's crib, froze. Her face drained of color, her small body tensing like a cornered animal. James had never seen such naked fear on a child's face. The woman who appeared in the doorway was exactly what James expected, and exactly what he despised. Victoria Evans stood perhaps 5'8" in expensive heels that matched her designer coat. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves around a face that combined beauty with calculated vulnerability. Tears that hadn't smudged her flawless makeup glistened in wide eyes. Oh, thank God, she breathed upon seeing Henry, her manicured hand pressed dramatically to her heart. Then her gaze found Sophie, hardening for just a millisecond before softening again. Sophie, darling, I've been so worried. James intercepted her before she could approach the children. Mrs. Evans, I presume? Victoria's performance barely faltered as she assessed James. His expensive clothing, his commanding presence, the protective stance he'd taken between her and the children. Yes, and you are. James Mitchell, I found your stepchildren nearly frozen to death on my property tonight. Victoria's expression shifted to perfectly calibrated shock. What? That's impossible. They were asleep in their beds. I checked on them before I took my sleeping pill. Behind James, Sophie made a small, disbelieving sound. Patricia Green had returned and now watched the interaction with sharp, professional interest. That's strange, James replied, his tone deceptively conversational. Because when Sophie regained consciousness, she described being forced outside in a blizzard as punishment for asking for medicine for her sick brother. Victoria's face transformed with practiced outrage. That's absurd. Sophie has always had an active imagination. Ever since her father died, she's been troubled, making up stories, acting out. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial level. The therapist says it's her way of processing grief. It was masterfully done. James had to admire the performance even as it disgusted him. Victoria had established herself as the concerned, slightly overwhelmed stepmother to troubled children, while preemptively discrediting anything Sophie might say. I see, James responded, matching her quiet tone. And do these made-up stories explain the cigarette burns and belt marks on her body? Victoria's composure slipped, just for an instant. Something cold and calculating flashed behind her perfect facade. Children her age are always getting bumps and bruises. Sophie is particularly accident-prone. Mrs. Evans, Patricia interjected, given the nature of Sophie's injuries and the circumstances in which the children were found, we'll need to conduct a formal investigation. Victoria turned her charm on the social worker. Of course, I understand completely. Children's safety must come first. She glanced back at Sophie with what appeared to be concern. I just want to take my poor children home where I can care for them properly. That won't be possible immediately, Patricia stated, her professional mask firmly in place. Henry requires hospitalization and, given the allegations, we'll need to determine appropriate temporary placement for both children. Allegations? Victoria's voice rose slightly, perfectly calibrated indignation. Based on the tales of a troubled 7-year-old? Surely you can't be serious. The medical evidence is quite serious, Dr. Martinez interjected, having returned to check on Henry. Both children show signs of malnourishment. Henry has an advanced respiratory infection that should have been treated days ago. And Sophie's injuries. He shook his head, professional composure barely containing his disgust. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze sweeping the room, reassessing the situation. James recognized the calculation, a predator determining whether to fight or retreat. I understand your concerns, she said finally, her voice heavy with manufactured sincerity. Of course, Henry's health comes first. I had no idea his cold had become so serious. As for Sophie's injuries, children can be secretive about accidents when they fear getting in trouble for misbehavior. The deliberate implication that Sophie's injuries were self-inflicted or the result of forbidden activities made James's jaw tighten. Before he could respond, Sophie spoke up, her voice small but steady. You pushed us out in the snow. You said Henry was too much trouble. You said maybe the cold would teach us to be grateful. Victoria's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into sympathetic concern. Oh, Sophie, these fantasies aren't healthy, sweetheart. This is exactly what the therapist warned about. James had seen enough. Mrs. Green, I'm willing to provide temporary housing for both children while your investigation proceeds. My home has more than enough space, and I can ensure they receive proper medical care and supervision. Victoria turned on him, the mask slipping further. And who exactly are you to make such an offer? Some rich man who thinks he can buy anything he wants? These are my children legally. I have documentation. Documentation signed rather quickly after their father's convenient accident, James remarked mildly. I'm sure the authorities will find that timeline interesting. Victoria went very still, her eyes narrowing dangerously. For the first time, the calculating predator beneath the perfect exterior was fully visible. She stepped closer to James, lowering her voice. You have no idea what you're getting involved in, Mr. Mitchell. I have friends in places that could make even your life difficult. James met her gaze without flinching. So do I, Mrs. Evans. The difference is mine actually respect me rather than fear me. Now, I suggest you cooperate with Ms. Green's investigation if you want to maintain any pretense of being a fit guardian. Victoria's perfect mask reassembled itself with impressive speed. She turned to Patricia with a regretful smile. I can see everyone is very concerned. Of course, the children's well-being comes first. I'll cooperate fully with your investigation, though I'm confident you'll find these allegations unfounded. She glanced toward the bed where Henry lay, tubes and monitors attached to his tiny body, then at Sophie, who pressed herself against the wall as if trying to disappear. I'll come back tomorrow when everyone's had some rest, Victoria announced magnanimously. Sophie, be good for the doctors. With that parting instruction, laden with subtle threat, Victoria swept from the room, leaving behind the cloying scent of expensive perfume and the chill of predatory calculation. As her footsteps faded, Sophie exhaled a shuddering breath. She's angry. When she's angry, she hurts us. James knelt beside her, bringing himself to her eye level. She won't hurt either of you again. That's a promise. Sophie studied him with that unnervingly adult gaze. She has important friends. She always says no one will believe us over her. Then we'll find evidence that speaks for itself, James replied. I didn't build my company by backing down from bullies, Sophie. Patricia cleared her throat. Mr. Mitchell, while I appreciate your concern, there are procedures that must be followed. The children should technically go into emergency foster care while we investigate. James straightened, fixing the social worker with the steady gaze that had intimidated far more powerful opponents. Mrs. Green, we both know the system is overwhelmed. These children have been through enough trauma tonight. Henry needs specialized medical care, and Sophie needs to stay with her brother. I can provide stability, security, and whatever resources they need while your investigation proceeds. Patricia hesitated, clearly torn between procedure and practicality. It would require temporary emergency approval, signed by a judge. I believe Judge Harmon is still on the hospital board, James remarked casually. I'd be happy to call him at home if needed. The name drop had its intended effect. Judge Harmon was known for his uncompromising stance on child welfare, often bending procedural rules when children's safety was at stake. That might expedite matters, Patricia admitted reluctantly. 2 hours later, with Henry stabilized and temporary emergency guardianship paperwork signed, James sat in a chair beside the hospital bed. Sophie had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled in an uncomfortable position that allowed her to keep one hand on her brother's tiny arm. James studied the sleeping children, so vulnerable yet so remarkably resilient. In the space of a single night, his carefully constructed isolation had been shattered. The protective walls he'd built around himself after losing his family now extended to encompass these two broken souls who had literally appeared on his doorstep. His phone vibrated with a text from his private investigator, a man kept on retainer primarily for corporate matters, now repurposed for a far more personal mission. Found preliminary info on Gregory Evans. Death ruled accident, but circumstances suspicious. We'll dig deeper. Also, Victoria Evans was born Veronica Kelman, has history of targeting wealthy men. 3 previous marriages all ended when money ran dry or under suspicious circumstances. More tomorrow. James glanced at the sleeping children, something fierce and unfamiliar igniting in his chest. The game had changed. Victoria Evans, or whatever her real name was, had picked the wrong targets this time. His phone buzzed with another message from his assistant, reminding him of tomorrow's board meeting, the quarterly reports that needed review, the potential acquisition that had consumed his attention for months. None of it seemed important anymore. James sent a brief reply. Cancel everything for the next week, family emergency. He settled back in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his gaze fixed on Sophie and Henry. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, James Mitchell made a silent vow. These children would never again suffer at the hands of those meant to protect them. Not while he drew breath. For the first time since losing his family, James felt something like purpose stirring within him. Something worth fighting for, something worth living for. The storm outside had finally passed, but James knew the real battle was just beginning. The first rays of morning sunlight transformed James Mitchell's pristine mansion, illuminating spaces that had known only shadows for years. 3 days had passed since that fateful night when 2 children appeared on his doorstep. 3 days since his carefully constructed isolation shattered like thin ice beneath unexpected weight. Henry's condition had stabilized enough for hospital discharge, though the infant still required careful monitoring and medication. James had transformed his home office into a temporary nursery, equipping it with everything a recovering baby might need. The pristine guest room adjacent to his own master suite now belonged to Sophie, though James noted she spent most nights sleeping on a chair beside Henry's crib. James stood in the doorway of the makeshift nursery, coffee cooling in his forgotten mug. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully organizing medications with the precision of a seasoned pharmacist. Her small fingers arranged the bottles by administration time, her blue eyes serious as she checked each label twice. The burns on her arms had begun healing under proper medical care, but the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of nightmares that wouldn't relent. "You don't need to do everything yourself anymore," James said softly. Sophie looked up, startled. Her wariness had diminished over the days, but never completely vanished. "I know what Henry needs. I've always taken care of him." "I don't doubt that." James entered the room and knelt beside her, his knees protesting the unaccustomed position. "But you're 7, Sophie. You should be playing, drawing, reading books, being a child." Sophie's expression remained solemn. "I don't remember how to do that." The simple admission struck James with unexpected force. How similar they were, both having forgotten how to simply live rather than survive. "Perhaps we could learn together," James suggested, surprising himself with the offer. Before Sophie could respond, James's phone vibrated. His private investigator, Maxwell Turner, had sent a text. "Need to meet. Found something big. Usual place. Noon." James made arrangements for lunch to be delivered, showed Sophie how to use the house intercom system to reach him anywhere on the property, and left the children in the capable hands of Mrs. Harrison, a retired nurse he'd hired as a temporary caregiver. The usual place was an unassuming diner on the outskirts of Aspen, far from the glittering resorts and celebrity hangouts. Maxwell Turner occupied a corner booth, his weathered face a map of decades in law enforcement before turning private. A manila folder sat untouched beside his coffee cup. "Your instincts were right," Turner said without preamble as James slid into the booth. "Gregory Evans didn't die in an accident." James signaled the waitress for coffee. "Tell me." Turner opened the folder, revealing photographs of a wrecked luxury sedan. Evans supposedly lost control on Bear Creek Road. Car went over the guardrail, rolled 3 times before hitting the creek bed. "But look here." He pointed to close-up images of the vehicle's undercarriage. Brake line was cut, clean professional job. Police report missed it entirely. Deliberately missed it or incompetence? That's where it gets interesting. Turner slid across a document showing bank transfers. The investigating officer, Detective Reeves, received $50,000 in an offshore account 3 days after ruling the death accidental. James's jaw tightened. "Victoria?" "Ultimately, yes, but the money came through 3 intermediaries before reaching Reeves. All led back to Monarch Holdings. Charles Warner's company," James said, the pieces connecting. Warner was a rival businessman whose reputation for ruthless tactics bordered on criminal. James had crossed paths with him several times over the years, each encounter leaving a bitter taste. Turner nodded. Victoria Evans, born Veronica Kelman, worked as Warner's executive assistant 5 years ago. Left his employ shortly before meeting Gregory Evans. A planned infiltration, James mused. Warner placed her in Evans' path, knowing his weakness for beautiful younger women after his wife's death. Gets worse, Turner continued, producing more documents. Evans was on the verge of exposing major financial fraud at Western Regional Bank. Guess who sits on their board and has most of his assets tied up in their investment vehicles? Charles Warner. The picture became clearer. Victoria marries Evans. Evans gathers intelligence, reports back to Warner. When Evans gets too close to exposing the fraud, he has an unfortunate accident. Turner's expression darkened. But Warner and Victoria didn't anticipate one thing: Evans's will. Instead of leaving everything to his new wife, he placed 90% of his assets in trust for his children. Victoria only gets access as their guardian. James leaned back, understanding dawning. So the abuse, the neglect. My guess? She was trying to arrange an accident for the kids too. Something that wouldn't raise suspicions. Exposure to extreme cold would do it. Hypothermia looks natural, leaves little evidence. Cold fury settled in James's chest. The children are sitting on a fortune they don't even know about. 300 million conservatively, Turner confirmed. And if Victoria can't access it as their guardian, Warner loses everything when the fraud is exposed, James finished. The children are the only loose ends. Turner closed the folder. You stepped into something ugly, James. These people won't stop. The temporary guardianship helps, but Victoria will fight it. And Warner operates in shadows deeper than most. I've never shied away from ugly fights, James replied. His phone chimed with a message from his assistant. Victoria Evans had filed an emergency petition contesting his guardianship, with a hearing scheduled in 21 days. 21 days, James murmured. 3 weeks to build a case strong enough to keep those children safe. Turner's expression grew grim. You'll need more than financial records in suspicious circumstances. Judges want concrete evidence, especially when removing children from legal guardians. Then we'll find it, James said with the quiet certainty that had built his empire. Whatever it takes. The mansion felt different upon James's return, somehow warmer despite the cutting mountain wind outside. The sound of a child's hesitant laughter echoed through rooms that had known only silence for years. James followed the unfamiliar sound to the kitchen, where he found Sophie perched on a stool, flour dusting her nose and cheeks. Mrs. Harrison stood nearby, guiding Sophie's small hands as they shaped cookie dough. Sophie looked up, her smile faltering slightly when she saw James. Mrs. Harrison said we could make cookies. Is that okay? The uncertainty in her voice, the instinctive bracing for disapproval, spoke volumes about her previous life. James felt that now familiar protective surge rise within him. Of course it's okay, he assured her, hanging his coat on a nearby hook. In fact, I might demand payment in the form of at least 2 cookies. The tension left Sophie's shoulders, her smile returning cautiously. Henry's been good today. He only cried a little when he took his medicine. James approached the counter, inspecting her handiwork. You've been taking care of him for a long time, haven't you? Sophie nodded, carefully placing another ball of dough on the baking sheet. Since he was born, Mom died right after. The doctors tried to save her, but they couldn't. That must have been very hard for all of you, James said softly. Sophie's hands stilled. Dad cried a lot at first. Then he just worked all the time. He said looking at Henry reminded him of Mom, but in a sad way. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes I think that's why he married Victoria, so he wouldn't be sad anymore. The insight, so profound from one so young, caught James off guard. He'd witnessed business titans with decades of experience show less emotional intelligence than this child. Adults make mistakes, James acknowledged. Sometimes we think we can escape pain by running from it or by replacing what we've lost, but it doesn't usually work that way. Is that why you live alone in this big house? Sophie asked, her directness startling him. Because you're running from something? Mrs. Harrison tactfully busied herself checking the oven, giving them privacy within the conversation. James considered deflecting but found himself answering honestly. Yes, my wife and daughter died 5 years ago, car accident like your father. I was supposed to be with them, but I chose to attend a business meeting instead. Sophie absorbed this, her young face solemn. So you think it's your fault? I know it is, James replied simply. If I'd been driving instead of Catherine, they might still be alive. Sophie placed another cookie on the tray, her movements deliberate. Dad used to say that blame doesn't fix anything. It just gives you somewhere to put your pain. James stared at her, struck speechless by wisdom he'd paid therapists thousands to impart less effectively. Maybe, Sophie continued, her focus on the cookies allowing her unusual candor, you're not really running from them. Maybe you're running from yourself. Before James could formulate a response to this devastating insight, his phone rang. Michael Chen, his longtime attorney and friend, was calling with news about the custody petition. As James excused himself to take the call, he glanced back at Sophie. She had already returned to her task, small hands working with the serious focus that characterized everything she did. In just 3 days, this child had seen through defenses he'd spent years perfecting. Michael's news confirmed what Turner had already revealed. Victoria had filed for immediate restoration of guardianship, claiming James had manipulated the children and fabricated abuse allegations. She's moving aggressively, Michael reported. Her attorney is Raymond Wells. James recognized the name. Wells specialized in high-profile custody battles, with a reputation for ruthless tactics and strategic media leaks. They're requesting psychological evaluations of the children, Michael continued, claiming Sophie has a history of fabricating stories for attention. They've submitted statements from therapists, teachers, and family friends attesting to Victoria's exemplary parenting. Paid statements, no doubt, James replied. What are we up against timeline-wise? Court date is 3 weeks from today. Judge Eleanor Winters presiding. James's spirits lifted slightly. Judge Winters was known for her thorough approach and unwavering focus on children's welfare. She couldn't be bought or swayed by emotional theatrics. We need concrete evidence, James said, not just suspicious circumstances. Turner found proof the brake lines on Gregory's car were tampered with. Start there. That connects Warner to Gregory's death, potentially, Michael noted. But we need to establish Victoria's pattern of abuse toward the children specifically. Without that, even murder conspiracy evidence won't necessarily prevent her from regaining custody. James watched through the window as snow began falling again, coating his property in pristine white. The children are all that matters here, Michael. Use every resource we have. I want Victoria Evans nowhere near Sophie and Henry ever again. After disconnecting, James returned to the kitchen to find Sophie carefully transferring freshly baked cookies to a cooling rack. She worked with the precision of a surgeon, her small face set in concentration. They smell wonderful, James commented, leaning against the counter. Sophie offered a tentative smile. Dad used to say cookies make everything better, even for a little while. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Sophie said simply, until Victoria made him not himself anymore. James chose his next words carefully. Sophie, I need to tell you something important. Victoria is trying to regain custody of you and Henry. Fear flashed across Sophie's face, her hands freezing mid-motion. No, we can't go back. She'll hurt us again. Worse this time because we ran away. I won't let that happen, James assured her. But to stop her, I need to prove to the judge what kind of person she really is. Can you help me do that? Sophie set down the spatula, her expression growing cautious. How? By telling me everything. No detail is too small, and by meeting with someone who can help document what happened to you and Henry. Sophie's eyes darted toward the doorway, checking the hall as if expecting Victoria to materialize at any moment. She always said no one would believe me, that I was just a stupid little girl making up stories. James knelt to her eye level, ignoring the protest from his knees. I believe you, Sophie, and I will make sure the judge believes you too. Sophie studied him with that unnerving intensity, searching for any sign of deception. Whatever she sought, she appeared to find its absence reassuring. Okay, she whispered, I'll tell you everything. The following days established a new rhythm in the mansion. James converted the library into a temporary office, allowing him to work from home rather than leaving the children. Sophie gradually revealed more details of their life with Victoria, small cruelties that had escalated to dangerous neglect, nights locked in closets, meals withheld as punishment, Henry left in soiled diapers until Sophie could sneak away to change him. Dr. Laura Wilson, a child psychologist specializing in trauma, made daily visits. Initially, Sophie retreated into wary silence during these sessions. By the end of the first week, however, she had begun to trust the gentle, grandmotherly doctor enough to share her experiences. James found unexpected allies in his mission. Sarah Peterson, a retired detective who had moved next door after 30 years with Denver PD, offered her expertise in building evidence for abuse cases. Mrs. Harrison, the nurse, documented Henry's improving health with meticulous notes, creating a record of his previous neglect. On the 8th day, as a fresh snowfall blanketed the mountains, James received a call from Turner. "Found something you need to see," the investigator said without preamble. "I've been checking Victoria's movements before Gregory's death. 2 weeks prior, she met with a man named Marcus Lessing at a hotel in Denver. 5 separate meetings. Who is Lessing? Former military, dishonorably discharged. Specializes in accidents that don't look like murder. I tracked his bank accounts. 50,000 deposited the day after Gregory Evans went off that mountain road." James's grip tightened on the phone. "Can we find him?" "Already did. He's in Boulder, living under another name, but he's nervous, looking over his shoulder. Warner must have realized we're digging." "Make contact," James instructed. "Offer whatever it takes for his testimony." As James ended the call, he noticed Sophie standing in the doorway, Henry balanced on her hip. The infant had improved dramatically under proper care, his cheeks filling out, his eyes brighter and more alert. "Was that about Victoria?" Sophie asked, her perception unnervingly accurate. James considered deflecting, but opted for honesty. "Yes, we're gathering evidence to show the judge who she really is." Sophie shifted Henry to her other hip with practiced ease. "She has important friends. She always told Dad that if he ever crossed her, her friends would destroy him." "She was referring to Charles Warner," James said gently. "I know about him, Sophie, and unlike your father, I've dealt with men like Warner before." Sophie's expression remained doubtful. "Victoria always gets what she wants, always." "Not this time," James promised. "Not when it comes to you and Henry." That afternoon, James received a detailed report from Dr. Wilson confirming signs of long-term psychological abuse in Sophie's behavior. The documentation of Henry's medical recovery further established the neglect both children had suffered. The case was building, piece by careful piece. On the 10th day, a courier delivered an envelope containing photographs. James carrying Sophie from the hospital, Henry in his arms at the mansion, the 3 of them returning from a doctor's appointment. Attached was a note in elegant handwriting. "Children need their mother. Reconsider your position, or these go to the press with an interesting narrative. You have 48 hours. James stared at the photos, anger building in his chest. Victoria was escalating, moving from legal channels to outright intimidation. He placed a call to his head of security, arranging for additional personnel around the property. As he completed the call, he noticed Sophie watching from the doorway again, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked, her sensitivity to tension obviously honed by years of walking on eggshells. James sighed, deciding again on honesty. "Victoria's trying to pressure me into giving up custody." Sophie's eyes widened with fear. "Are you going to?" The question held such vulnerability that James crossed the room and knelt before her. "Sophie, listen to me carefully. There is nothing that would make me send you and Henry back to that woman. No amount of threats or pressure will change that. Do you understand?" Sophie studied his face, searching for lies or uncertainty. "Why are you doing all this for us? We're not your family." The question struck James unexpectedly. Why indeed had he thrown his carefully ordered life into chaos for 2 children who had literally appeared on his doorstep? The answer came with surprising clarity. "Maybe you're not family by blood," he said slowly, "but you and Henry remind me what it means to fight for something more important than money or power or reputation. You remind me what it means to be human." Sophie absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. "Victoria will be really mad when she loses." "Let her be," James replied simply. That evening, as James worked through custody documents in the library, he heard a soft tapping at the door. Sophie stood there in pajamas Mrs. Harrison had purchased, clutching a worn backpack. "Can I show you something?" she asked tentatively. "Of course." Sophie approached his desk and carefully opened the backpack, removing a manila envelope. "Dad gave me this before he died. He said to keep it safe and not tell Victoria about it." James accepted the envelope with a sense of reverence for the trust being placed in him. Inside, he found USB drives, handwritten notes, and several legal documents. "Dad was worried," Sophie explained, perching on the edge of a nearby chair. "He said Victoria wasn't who she pretended to be. He started putting important things in a special box and showed me where it was hidden. The night before the accident, he gave me this envelope." James examined the contents more closely. Gregory Evans had documented conversations with Victoria, noting inconsistencies in her background. He'd hired a private investigator, much as James had done, and discovered her connection to Charles Warner. Most damning was a recorded conversation between Gregory and Victoria, where she slipped and mentioned details about Warner's financial dealings that she shouldn't have known. "Sophie, this is incredibly important," James said, struggling to contain his excitement. "Your father was building a case against Victoria and Warner. This could be the evidence we need." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Dad said if anything happened to him, I should give this to someone I trusted." Her blue eyes met his. "I think that's you." The simple statement of faith humbled James in a way business success never had. Before he could respond, the mansion's security system chimed with an alert. Someone had breached the outer perimeter. James quickly checked the security feed on his tablet to see two men in dark clothing approaching through the snow. "Stay here," he instructed Sophie, locking the library door behind him as he left. James made his way to the security office, where his head of security, Reynolds, was already coordinating the response. "Two intruders coming from the east side," Reynolds reported. "We've alerted local police, but response time is 15 minutes minimum in this weather." James watched the feeds as his security team intercepted the intruders. The ensuing struggle was brief but violent. One man escaped into the darkness, but the second was subdued and detained. When police finally arrived, the captured intruder refused to speak. A search revealed no identification, but he carried a syringe containing a powerful sedative and plastic restraints, tools for abduction rather than burglary. "They were coming for the children," James stated flatly to the police officer taking his statement. The officer, clearly uncomfortable with the high-profile nature of the incident, maintained professional neutrality. "We can't determine intent without more evidence, Mr. Mitchell." "I can," James replied coldly. After the police departed with the still silent intruder, James checked on Henry, finding him asleep and unaware of the night's events. When he returned to the library, Sophie sat exactly where he'd left her, though fear had replaced trust in her eyes. "Victoria sent them, didn't she?" she asked without preamble. James considered lying to protect her, but those solemn blue eyes deserved honesty. "I believe so, yes." Sophie nodded, unsurprised. "She always said she'd find us if we ever ran away." "My security team will ensure no one gets near you or Henry," James assured her. "You can't watch us forever," Sophie said softly. "Victoria never stops when she decides something." The practical fatalism in her young voice broke something in James's heart. No child should understand such relentless malevolence. "Sophie," he said firmly, "I built a global company by outlasting, outthinking, and outmaneuvering opponents far more powerful than Victoria Evans. I promise you she will never hurt you or Henry again." Sophie didn't respond immediately. She carefully returned her father's documents to the backpack before finally meeting James's gaze. "When Dad made promises, he kept them," she said slowly, "until Victoria changed him." The unspoken question hung between them. Would James change too? "Some promises are worth any cost," James replied. "Protecting you and Henry is one of those promises." The following morning brought unwelcome news. The captured intruder had been found dead in his cell, an apparent suicide, though the timing raised obvious suspicions. More concerning still, Victoria had scheduled a press conference for that afternoon. "She's taking this public," Michael warned during their morning call. "My sources say she's planning to paint you as a disturbed, lonely rich man who's essentially kidnapped her children in some misguided attempt to replace your own family." James's jaw tightened. "She's getting desperate." "Desperate people are dangerous, James, and Warner has considerable media influence." "Schedule our own press conference immediately after hers," James instructed. "I want to respond to whatever narrative she creates." "Are you sure that's wise? The more public this becomes, the harder it will be for Warner to arrange convenient accidents," James finished. "I want this in the spotlight, Michael. Darkness is their ally, not mine." By noon, Victoria's strategy became clear. Major news outlets carried her tearful plea for the return of her beloved stepchildren, whom she claimed had been manipulated by a powerful billionaire with a disturbed fixation on replacing his lost family. She presented carefully curated photographs showing happy moments with Sophie and Henry, while her attorney distributed statements from therapists claiming Sophie had a history of fabricating stories for attention. James watched the performance with cold fury, noting how Victoria portrayed herself as the grieving widow, dedicated stepmother, and helpless victim of James's wealth and influence. When his turn came before the cameras, James took a different approach. Rather than emotional appeals, he presented facts, medical records documenting Henry's malnourished state, photographs of Sophie's injuries, timeline discrepancies in Victoria's story. "I am Not asking the public to take sides, James stated calmly. I am asking the courts to examine evidence and put the welfare of two vulnerable children above all other considerations. Unlike Mrs. Evans, I welcome full investigation into this matter. The contrasting approaches created precisely the media firestorm James had anticipated. By nightfall, public opinion had divided, but more importantly, the story had become too high profile for any convenient accidents to befall the children, or James himself. That evening, as snowfall intensified outside, James found Sophie sitting in the window seat of her room, watching the security team patrol the grounds. Are you okay? He asked, remaining in the doorway to respect her space. Sophie continued staring out the window. I saw Victoria on TV today. She was crying and saying she misses us. How did that make you feel? Sophie turned to face him, her expression unnervingly adult. She's a good liar. She always knows what to say to make people believe her. James entered the room and sat beside her on the window seat. The difference now is that we have evidence, not just her word against yours. But she has all those people saying I make up stories, Sophie countered, her voice small. The therapist, my teachers, people who've never seen what happens behind closed doors, James pointed out gently. Sophie hugged her knees to her chest. What if the judge believes her? What if we have to go back? The fear in her voice stirred something fierce in James's chest. Sophie, look at me. She raised her eyes reluctantly. If the court makes that mistake, we have options. Appeals, additional evidence, even, he hesitated, then continued with quiet conviction, even leaving the country if necessary. I will not let you or Henry return to an abusive situation, no matter what. Sophie studied him, weighing his words against her experiences with adults who had failed her. You'd really leave everything, your company, your house, everything you've built? Without hesitation, James confirmed. Some things matter more than empires. Sophie fell silent, processing this. After a long moment, she slipped her small hand into his, the first time she had initiated such contact. Thank you, she whispered. The simple gesture, the tentative trust it represented, affected James more profoundly than any business triumph in his storied career. As the court date approached, James divided his time between building their case and creating a real home for the children. The mansion that had once served as his mausoleum gradually transformed into a living space. A playground appeared in the east wing. The formal dining room now featured booster seats and colorful plates alongside fine china. Sophie began to display small signs of normal childhood, requesting specific foods, occasionally giggling at cartoons, drawing pictures that didn't exclusively feature Henry's safety. The hypervigilance that had characterized her first weeks never entirely vanished, but it lessened incrementally. Henry thrived under proper care, meeting developmental milestones with enthusiasm. His first intentional smile, directed at James during a late-night feeding, created a warmth in James's chest that no financial victory had ever approximated. 14 days after the children arrived, as James worked through case documents in the library, Sophie appeared in the doorway. Without a word, she crossed the room and placed a drawing on his desk. 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright sun. The largest figure wore what appeared to be a tie. The smallest had a rounded body suggesting an infant. Above them, in careful block letters, she had written, "Family?" The question mark broke and mended James's heart simultaneously. "Is this us?" he asked gently. Sophie nodded, not meeting his eyes. "It's silly. I just thought—" "It's not silly at all," James interrupted, carefully pinning the drawing to his bulletin board where his most important documents usually hung. "It's the most important thing anyone has given me in years." Sophie's shy smile illuminated the room more effectively than the expensive lighting system. 3 days later, Turner arrived at the mansion with news that changed everything. Marcus Lessing, the man linked to Gregory Evans' murder, had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. "He's terrified," Turner reported. "Says Warner has already tried to eliminate him once. But he's kept evidence, photographs of meetings with Victoria, recordings of their conversations planning Gregory's murder." James felt a surge of vindication. This connects Victoria directly to Gregory's death and proves she conspired with Warner from the beginning, Turner added. Lessing claims Victoria explicitly discussed taking care of the children next, once she secured full control of the trust fund. Cold rage filled James at the confirmation of what he'd suspected. Victoria had been planning to murder Sophie and Henry, innocent children whose only crime was standing between her and millions of dollars. "Where is Lessing now?" "Safe house outside Denver. My people are watching him 24/7 until the hearing." James nodded approval. Good, we can't afford to lose him. The day before the custody hearing, Victoria made her final move. As James reviewed last-minute preparations with Michael, his assistant interrupted with an urgent message. Charles Warner had requested a private meeting. Absolutely not, Michael objected immediately. Any private conversation could be misconstrued, used against you tomorrow. James considered this, or it could reveal just how desperate they've become. After careful consideration, James agreed to meet Warner at a neutral location, an upscale restaurant with private dining rooms and multiple security cameras. He arranged for Turner to monitor the meeting remotely and for Michael to wait nearby. Charles Warner proved precisely as James remembered. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the practiced charm of a man accustomed to wielding power. His handshake was firm, his smile never reaching cold eyes. James, Warner began once they were seated in the private room, I appreciate you making time on what must be a busy day for you. James merely nodded, waiting. Warner chuckled. Always the strategist. Very well, I'll be direct. This situation with Victoria Evans and the children has become unnecessarily complicated. I believe we can resolve it to everyone's satisfaction. I'm listening, James replied neutrally. Warner opened a leather portfolio, removing a document. A proposal. Victoria withdraws her petition for custody. You maintain guardianship of the children. In exchange, the trust established for the children makes certain investments, specifically $20 million in Monarch Holdings. Laundering the children's money through your failing company, James observed. Creative but illegal. Warner's smile remained fixed. Think of it as an opportunity. The children get stability with you. You get an uncontested guardianship. Victoria moves on with a reasonable settlement. Everyone wins. Except Gregory Evans, who was murdered for uncovering your fraud, James countered. And except the children whose inheritance you are attempting to plunder. Warner's expression hardened. Allegations without proof are dangerous, James, particularly when made by a man with your history. My history? Grief can distort perception, Warner said with false sympathy. A man who lost his family tragically, who lives alone in isolation for years, suddenly fixates on two random children. Psychologists have terms for such behavior. The implied threat was clear. Warner would paint James as mentally unstable if he didn't cooperate. Marcus Lessing, James said simply. Warner's composure slipped momentarily. I don't know who. He's agreed to testify, Charles. About Victoria's meetings with him, about planning Gregory's murder, about your payments afterward. He's kept quite detailed records. Real fear flickered across Warner's face before his mask reassembled. Hearsay from a criminal seeking immunity. Hardly compelling. Combined with Gregory's own evidence, the recordings, the documentation he gathered before his death, I think the district attorney will find it very compelling indeed. Warner's confidence visibly faltered. He hadn't known about Gregory's evidence. What do you want? He asked, business pragmatism replacing charm. Tomorrow, Victoria withdraws her petition and relinquishes all claims to the children. Permanently. James leaned forward. In exchange, I focus solely on securing the children's future and don't actively pursue murder charges. And if I refuse, then tomorrow I present not only evidence of abuse, but also of conspiracy to murder. Victoria goes to prison, and you follow shortly after when Lessing's testimony connects you to Gregory's death. Warner studied him, calculating odds as any businessman would. You're bluffing. You don't have enough to make murder charges stick. James smiled thinly. Would you bet your freedom on that assumption? Silence stretched between them, the air charged with the confrontation of two powerful men accustomed to winning. Finally, Warner closed his portfolio. I'll speak with Victoria. You have until 9 tomorrow morning, James said, rising. After that, everything we have goes to the district attorney and the press simultaneously. Warner remained seated, his expression unreadable. You've changed, James. The man I knew 5 years ago lived for nothing but his company. Perhaps I needed to remember what actually matters, James replied before walking away. As James left the restaurant, he felt a strange lightness. For 5 years, he had allowed grief to narrow his existence to boardrooms and balance sheets. These children, with their resilience and vulnerability, had awakened something he thought long dead, the capacity to care beyond himself. His phone rang as he reached his car. Turner's voice came through, tense with urgency. We've got a problem. Lessing's safe house was hit 15 minutes ago. 2 of my men are down. Lessing is missing. James's momentary triumph evaporated. Warner moved faster than I anticipated. There's more, Turner continued grimly. Victoria's gone too, packed up and disappeared within the last hour. My source inside her legal team says she withdrew all available cash before vanishing. Cold realization settled over James. They're running. Appears that way. Or planning something desperate, James added, a new fear taking hold. If Victoria and Warner felt cornered, with nothing to lose, James called the mansion immediately. No answer. He tried Mrs. Harrison's cell phone, straight to voicemail. Dread building, he contacted Reynolds, his head of security. Sir, Reynolds' voice was strained. We have a situation. Mrs. Harrison was found unconscious in the kitchen. Sophie and Henry are missing. James's world stopped. What? How? Mrs. Harrison was drugged. Security footage shows a woman matching Victoria's description entering through the service entrance with a duplicate key card. She was inside for approximately 7 minutes before departing with both children. And no one stopped her? James demanded, already speeding toward the mansion. She had credentials, sir, the same ones you authorized. We're reviewing how she obtained duplicates. James ended the call, cold fury replacing panic. Warner and Victoria had made their final move, taking the children as leverage, or worse, eliminating the only witnesses who could connect them to Gregory's murder. As snow began falling again over the mountains, James Mitchell faced the most critical battle of his life. This wasn't about business empires or financial victories. 2 children's lives hung in the balance. 2 children who had awakened his dormant heart, who had shown him what truly mattered. Victoria had taken Sophie and Henry, believing she was eliminating obstacles. Instead, she had awakened a formidable adversary, a man with unlimited resources, unmatched determination, and nothing left to lose. For the first time in 5 years, James Mitchell had found something worth fighting for with every fiber of his being, and God help anyone who stood in his way. Snow fell in thick, unforgiving sheets across the Colorado mountains as James Mitchell transformed from businessman to hunter. The sophisticated CEO had vanished, replaced by a primal force driven by a single purpose: find Sophie and Henry. The mansion buzzed with urgent activity. Security personnel established a command center in the great room. Digital maps glowed on hastily mounted screens. James stood at the center, his face carved from granite, his voice precise as he issued commands. Every property connected to Victoria Evans or Charles Warner. Every vehicle registered in their names or their shell companies. Every alias we've identified. His eyes, cold as the storm outside, swept the room. These children have been missing for 2 hours. We will find them tonight. Mrs. Harrison sat nearby, a blanket around her shoulders, guilt etched in her gentle face. I never saw her coming, Mr. Mitchell. The tea, she must have drugged it. James softened momentarily, placing a hand on her shoulder. This isn't your fault. Victoria has been planning this for weeks. Detective Sarah Peterson, James's retired cop neighbor who had volunteered her expertise, studied traffic camera footage. Victoria's Mercedes was last spotted heading west on Mountain Pass Road 30 minutes ago. That leads to 3 possible destinations. Warner owns a hunting lodge near Emerald Lake, Turner added, pointing to a remote location on the map. Isolated, defensible, accessible only by one road. Perfect place to hide until arrangements can be made for leaving the country. James's mind raced through scenarios with the same analytical precision he applied to business strategy. They're cornered animals now. The children are either leverage or liabilities. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. If Victoria and Warner believed the children could testify against them, their lives were in immediate danger. Local police have been notified, Reynolds reported, but the storm is hampering their response. Estimated arrival at Warner's property, 90 minutes minimum. Too long, James stated flatly. We move now. Michael Chen, who had arrived minutes after James called, approached with concern. James, this isn't a corporate takeover. These people are dangerous, potentially murderers. Let law enforcement handle this. James checked the hunting rifle Turner had provided, his movements displaying unexpected familiarity with the weapon. The storm works in their favor with official channels. They're counting on that delay. His eyes met Michael's. I won't gamble with those children's lives. Before anyone could object further, James's phone rang. An unknown number. He signaled for silence and activated the speaker. Mitchell. His voice betrayed nothing of the storm raging within him. James, Victoria's voice, smooth as silk despite the circumstances. I believe we need to renegotiate our arrangement. Where are the children? James demanded. A cold laugh answered him. Safe, for now. Their continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation. If you harm them, Threats are beneath you, Victoria interrupted. You're a businessman. Let's discuss terms. James motioned for Turner to begin tracing the call. I'm listening. Simple. The evidence you've gathered against Charles and me disappears. Permanently. The Children's Trust Fund makes a substantial investment in Monarch Holdings. Let's say $50 million. You sign a binding agreement never to pursue any claims regarding Gregory's death. And in return, the children live, perhaps even with you if you're amenable to the right financial arrangements going forward. The casual way she leveraged the children's lives ignited something dangerous in James. But his voice remained controlled. I need proof they're unharmed. Of course. Victoria's voice dripped false reasonableness. Sophie, darling, say hello to Mr. Mitchell. A moment of silence, then Sophie's voice came through, thin but determined. James? Sophie? Relief flooded him at the sound of her voice. Are you and Henry all right? Henry's okay. He's sleeping. Her voice dropped to a whisper. We're in a big wooden house. I can see a lake through the windows. There's a blue boat. That's enough, Victoria snapped, her composure slipping momentarily. Sophie's voice disappeared. Turner gave James a thumbs up. They had the location, Emerald Lake, as suspected. You have 1 hour to gather the evidence and bring it to us, Victoria continued, unaware her location was compromised. Come alone. Any sign of police, any helicopters overhead, any attempt at heroics, and the children suffer the consequences. I'll need more time to access the offshore accounts, James replied, buying minutes they desperately needed. 2 hours minimum. 90 minutes, Victoria countered. Not a second more. I'll text you the exact coordinates. The call ended. James turned to his team, his decision already made. I'll approach from the main road as expected. Turner, take 4 men and circle around through the eastern forest. Sarah, coordinate with local police, but keep them at distance until we have the children secured. This is insanity, Michael protested. You're not trained for this kind of operation. James checked his watch. Neither is Victoria. She's desperate and cornered. That makes her dangerous, but also sloppy. He tucked the phone into his pocket. In business, I've always capitalized on my opponent's desperation. Tonight will be no different. The drive to Emerald Lake became a battle against both time and nature. James's Range Rover pushed through snowdrifts that would have stopped lesser vehicles. Visibility extended barely beyond his headlights as the storm intensified. Nature itself seemed determined to keep him from the children who had claimed an unexpected place in his heart. James used the drive to clear his mind, to focus his thoughts as he had before countless high-stakes negotiations. But this was different. For 30 years, he had built his reputation on calculating risks and benefits with cold precision. Tonight, calculation had been replaced by something more primal, something that had awakened the moment Sophie collapsed on his doorstep with Henry in her arms. The GPS indicated his approach to Warner's property. James reduced speed, headlights dimmed, alert for any sign of surveillance. The hunting lodge emerged from the snowy darkness, a massive structure of timber and stone, windows glowing amber against the white landscape. A fortress disguised as a retreat. James parked where he could maintain visual contact with both the front entrance and what appeared to be a rear exit. He retrieved a small leather case from the glove compartment. Not evidence, but items that might prove more valuable in the coming confrontation. His phone vibrated with an incoming message from Turner. Team in position, east and south perimeter secured, awaiting signal. James responded with a single word, proceed. The property's security system was sophisticated, but designed primarily to keep intruders out, not occupants in. Turner's team would exploit that weakness, creating a diversion that might provide the critical seconds James needed. Snow crunched beneath his boots as James approached the main entrance. Briefcase in hand, senses heightened to every sound, every movement. 2 armed men emerged from the shadows of the porch, their postures betraying limited professional training. Hands where we can see them, the taller one demanded. James complied, presenting himself as the businessman they expected, dangerous only behind a conference table. They patted him down efficiently, finding no weapons, then escorted him inside. The lodge's interior matched its imposing exterior, vaulted ceilings, massive stone fireplace, trophy heads mounted on walls. Charles Warner waited beside the fire, tumbler of scotch in hand, the picture of entitled leisure despite the circumstances. Victoria stood near a large window, her elegant appearance at odds with the predatory vigilance in her eyes. No sign of the children. Right on time, Warner observed, raising his glass in mock salute. Always the professional. Where are Sophie and Henry? James asked, his gaze sweeping the room, noting exits, potential weapons, sightlines. Safe, Victoria replied smoothly. They'll remain that way if you've brought what we asked for. James placed the briefcase on the heavy oak table between them. Everything I have on Gregory's murder, Warner's fraud, your abuse of the children. Original evidence stays in a secure location naturally, but this is everything you need to verify I'm meeting my end of our arrangement. Warner nodded to one of the guards who stepped forward to examine the contents. The man rifled through documents and flash drives with obvious incomprehension of their significance. Looks like papers and computer stuff, boss, he reported uncertainly. Warner's jaw tightened at the man's incompetence. Step back, he ordered, moving to inspect the materials himself. As Warner bent over the briefcase, James addressed Victoria. I've held up my end. Now bring me the children. Victoria's perfect lips curved in a smile that never reached her eyes. So impatient. First, we need to discuss the financial arrangements, the trust fund transfers, the investment structures. After I see the children, James insisted, unharmed. Warner looked up from the documents, irritation flashing across his features. You're hardly in a position to make demands, Mitchell. In case you've forgotten, we control the situation here. A distant crash echoed from somewhere outside the lodge, followed by the shrill wail of a security alarm. Warner's head jerked toward the sound, his composure slipping. Check it out, he barked at the guards. Now! As the men hurried from the room, James allowed himself a small, cold smile. Turner's diversion had begun precisely on schedule. Warner's eyes narrowed suspiciously. You didn't come alone. Insurance, James replied simply. Now the children, where are they? Victoria moved away from the window, her elegant composure showing the first cracks of uncertainty. This changes nothing. We still hold all the leverage here. Do you? James countered, his voice deceptively calm. Your escape route is compromised. Law enforcement has been alerted. Every minute you delay reduces your options exponentially. Another crash, closer this time. The remaining guard at the door shifted nervously. Warner set down his glass, calculation replacing arrogance in his gaze. Perhaps we should expedite matters. Victoria, bring the children. Let's conclude our business and depart. Victoria hesitated, something dangerous flickering behind her perfect facade. And then what, Charles? We hand over the only witnesses who can connect us to Gregory's death? How convenient for your peace of mind. The subtle fracture between the conspirators confirmed James's suspicion. Their alliance was dissolving under pressure. He had seen it countless times in business partnerships faced with failure. Blame shifted. Self-preservation overrode loyalty. Warner's expression hardened. We had an agreement, Victoria. We had many agreements, she replied coldly. Like your promise that taking Gregory's children would be simple, that no one would question a grieving widow, that his death would never be investigated. James watched the deteriorating partnership with calculated interest. Every second they focused on each other gave Turner's team more time to secure the perimeter, more time to locate Sophie and Henry. The children, James pressed again, now. Victoria's gaze snapped back to him, her perfect mask slipping further. Always about the children with you. What is it, James, trying to replace the family you lost? The daughter you failed to protect? The barb was precisely targeted, designed to provoke an emotional response. 5 years ago, it might have succeeded, but James had changed in ways Victoria couldn't comprehend. No, he replied simply. I'm trying to ensure you never harm another child again. Victoria's laugh held an edge of genuine amusement. How noble. The billionaire redeems himself by saving orphans. Did you imagine yourself their new father? Their protector? Her voice dropped to a venomous whisper. They were never going to stay with you, James. Once I had the money, they would have simply disappeared, just like their father. Warner stepped forward, alarm replacing calculation. Victoria, enough. Bring the children so we can conclude this transaction and leave. Victoria turned to Warner with newfound contempt. Always the businessman, Charles, even now. She moved toward a door at the rear of the great room. Very well, let's get this over with. The moment she disappeared through the door, James activated the small device in his pocket, a signal jammer Turner had provided. Warner's phone, which he'd been repeatedly checking, suddenly lost reception. What the hell? Warner muttered, staring at his device in confusion. Communications failure, James explained calmly. Standard security protocol in hostage situations. Your perimeter team can no longer warn you that they've been neutralized. Warner's composure collapsed entirely. He lunged for the desk drawer, extracting a handgun with unpracticed haste. Enough games, he snarled, aiming the weapon at James. You've miscalculated badly, Mitchell. Have I? James maintained his calm. In approximately 40 seconds, this lodge will be surrounded by both my security team and law enforcement. Victoria has already demonstrated she's willing to sacrifice you to save herself. Your only remaining option is cooperation. Warner's hand trembled slightly, the gun wavering. You're bluffing. I never bluff, James replied. It's inefficient. The lodge's power cut suddenly, plunging the room into darkness before emergency lighting activated with a dull amber glow. Warner's momentary distraction gave James the opening he needed. He moved with unexpected speed for a man who spent his days in boardrooms, closing the distance between them before Warner could react. The struggle was brief but violent. Warner had wealth and privilege. James had 5 years of suppressed rage seeking release. The gun discharged once, the bullet splintering a wooden beam overhead. James twisted Warner's wrist with brutal efficiency, forcing him to drop the weapon. As Warner crumpled to his knees, clutching his injured arm, the rear door burst open. Victoria stood framed in the doorway, her perfect appearance now disheveled, her eyes wild. In one arm, she clutched a sedated Henry. Her other hand gripped Sophie's arm with bruising force. Stop right there, she commanded, her voice shrill with panic. One more step, and she never finished the threat. Sophie, who had appeared docile, suddenly drove her elbow back with practiced precision, striking Victoria's ribs exactly where James had taught her during self-defense lessons they'd practiced in the mansion's gym. Victoria gasped, her grip loosening just enough for Sophie to wrench free and grab Henry from her arms. James watched with fierce pride as 7-year-old Sophie executed the escape maneuver perfectly, retreating to the corner they had established as their rendezvous point during late-night whispered contingency plans Victoria had never imagined a child would understand or remember. Victoria recovered quickly, reaching again for Sophie, but froze at the sound of multiple weapons being cocked. Turner and 2 of his men had entered through the front, firearms trained steadily on both Victoria and Warner. It's over, James said simply. Victoria's perfect mask shattered completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. Nothing is over, she hissed, reaching into her jacket. Don't, Turner warned sharply. Victoria ignored him, her hand emerging with a small revolver. Before she could aim, Turner fired once. The impact threw her backward, the unfired weapon clattering to the floor. She stared up at the ceiling in stunned disbelief, crimson blossoming across her designer blouse. James rushed to Sophie, shielding her and Henry from the scene. Don't look, he instructed gently, turning Sophie's face against his chest. It's over now. You're safe. Sophie clung to him, Henry secure in her other arm, her small body trembling, but her voice steady. You came for us. You really came. I promised I would, James replied, his throat tight with emotion. Nothing could have stopped me. Outside, police sirens wailed, growing closer despite the storm. Warner sat slumped against the desk, all arrogance erased by the reality of his situation. Victoria lay motionless where she had fallen, her perfect facade permanently shattered. James cradled the children against him, sheltering them from the chaos as police officers and paramedics flooded the lodge. In the midst of shouted orders and emergency protocols, Sophie looked up at James, her blue eyes clear despite everything she had endured. Can we go home now? She asked simply. Home. The word resonated through James with unexpected power. His mansion had been many things over the years, a showcase, a fortress, a mausoleum for his grief. Never a home. Until now. Yes, he promised, tightening his embrace around both children. We're going home. The aftermath unfolded with the efficiency James brought to all aspects of his life. Victoria was pronounced dead at the scene, her final act of violence ending her own life. Warner faced multiple charges: conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, financial fraud spanning years, attempted murder of federal witnesses. Marcus Lessing, who had been found bound but alive in Warner's basement, provided testimony that completed the case against Warner and posthumously against Victoria. Gregory Evans's murder was officially reclassified as homicide, his reputation restored as the evidence revealed his efforts to expose Warner's fraud. Through it all, James maintained a singular focus, protecting Sophie and Henry from additional trauma. He transformed part of the mansion into a therapeutic space where Dr. Wilson could continue their healing process. He arranged for their statements to be taken in comfortable settings, with child advocacy experts present. Most importantly, he began the formal adoption process immediately. 30 days after the rescue at Emerald Pond, James sat in Judge Eleanor Winter's chambers, Sophie beside him, Henry on his lap. The judge studied them thoughtfully, then reviewed the extensive documentation before her. "I've rarely seen such thorough preparation for an adoption petition, Mr. Mitchell," she observed. James nodded. The children deserve nothing less than absolute certainty in their future. Judge Winters removed her glasses, addressing Sophie directly. "Young lady, I understand you've been through extraordinary circumstances. How do you feel about Mr. Mitchell becoming your legal father?" Sophie, dressed in a blue dress she had selected herself, sat straighter. "James saved us, not just from Victoria, but from being scared all the time." She reached for James's hand. "He taught me that grown-ups can keep promises. That's what a real father does, isn't it?" Judge Winter's professional demeanor softened. "Indeed it is." She returned her attention to James. "And you understand that this is a lifetime commitment? These children have experienced profound abandonment and betrayal. They require absolute stability moving forward." "Your Honor," James replied, his voice steady with conviction. "For 5 years I've existed rather than lived, focused on building wealth while ignoring what gives life meaning. These children reminded me what truly matters. I am committed to being the father they deserve for as long as I draw breath." Judge Winters studied him, measuring his sincerity. Finally, she nodded, reaching for her pen. "In that case, I see no reason to delay. The court hereby approves the petition for adoption. Congratulations, Mr. Mitchell. Legally, officially, and irrevocably, you are now a family." Sophie's face illuminated with a smile that chased the last shadows from her eyes. Henry, who had begun forming simple words, reached for James's face and declared with perfect clarity, "Dada." James Mitchell, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, found himself unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. He simply gathered his children, his family, into his arms, holding them with the fierce protectiveness that had become as natural as breathing. Outside the courthouse, spring sunshine had replaced winter's fury. The mountains still wore caps of snow, but the valley blazed with new growth. James lifted Sophie onto his shoulders as they walked to the car, Henry secure in his other arm. "What happens now?" Sophie asked, her hands resting comfortably on James's head. "Anything you want," James replied. "We can travel. You can start school in the fall. We can get that puppy you've been secretly researching on the tablet." Sophie giggled, a sound that had become more frequent but never lost its wonder for James. "You knew about that?" "I know everything," James teased. "It's a dad's superpower." As they reached the car, Sophie grew serious again. "Will we always stay together? Really forever?" James set her down gently, crouching to meet her eyes directly. "Sophie Mitchell," he said, using their new shared surname with deliberate emphasis, "you and Henry are my family. Nothing will ever change that. Not time, not distance, not anything that might come our way. We belong together. Forever." Sophie studied him with that searching gaze that had become so familiar, the look that had assessed him that first night on his doorstep, that had measured his every promise against her experience of adult betrayal. "I believe you," she said finally, the simple statement representing a victory more significant than any corporate takeover. 1 year later, James stood on the deck of his renovated mansion, watching Sophie teach Henry to throw snowballs in the gentle winter sunshine. The property had transformed as dramatically as its owner, once a showcase of solitary wealth, now a genuine family home. The formal gardens had given way to a playground. The sterile guest rooms had become colorful bedrooms, a nursery, an art studio for Sophie's blossoming talent. Michael approached, handing James a coffee. "The board approved your family leave proposal. 6 months starting next week. They're calling it the Mitchell Family Initiative, guaranteed time off for adoptive parents." James nodded approval. "Good. No child should feel like they come second to a spreadsheet or a quarterly report." "You've changed the company," Michael observed. "First the trust for abuse victims, now this." The James Mitchell of 6 years ago would hardly recognize himself. James watched Sophie demonstrate a perfect throwing technique to Henry, her patience never wavering despite his clumsy attempts. I like to think he'd approve of the improvements. The mansion door opened behind them as Mrs. Harrison emerged with a tray of hot chocolate. The retired nurse had become a beloved grandmother figure to the children, her initial guilt over their kidnapping long replaced by devoted care. Sophie insisted we use the tiny marshmallows for Henry, she explained, smiling fondly. Apparently, they're superior to the large ones. James laughed. She's very specific about what her brother deserves. Always has been. As Mrs. Harrison called the children for their treat, James's phone vibrated with a news alert. Charles Warner had been sentenced to life without parole. The final chapter closed on the nightmare that had nearly destroyed these children. Sophie approached, her cheeks flushed from play, Henry toddling faithfully behind her. Dad, Henry made his first real snowball, all by himself. The pride in her voice, the casual use of dad that had once been so hesitant, filled James with quiet joy. That's incredible, bud, he praised, lifting Henry into his arms. You're getting so big. Sophie sipped her hot chocolate, studying James with unexpected seriousness. You look happy today. I'm happy, James confirmed. Even though it's snowing again, she pressed, her gaze intent. James recognized her unspoken reference. Snow had once signified danger, the night Victoria had cast them out. The blizzard they had barely survived. James knelt to her level, a habit he'd developed early in their relationship. Sophie, do you remember what you said to me last winter, after the adoption? She nodded slowly. I asked if we would always stay together. And I promised we would, James continued. Some promises change over time or get forgotten, but that one never will. He took her small hand in his. The snow brought you to me. It gave me back my heart when I thought it was gone forever. So yes, I'm happy when it snows. It reminds me of the night my real life began again. Sophie considered this, then set down her mug to throw her arms around his neck. I love you, Dad. I love you too, Sophie. James embraced both children, marveling at how these small beings had dismantled his carefully constructed isolation and rebuilt something infinitely more valuable in its place. That evening, as a gentle snowfall transformed the landscape into a wonderland of white, James tucked Sophie into bed. Henry already slept peacefully in his room across the hall, surrounded by the glow of star-shaped nightlights. Dad, Sophie asked as James prepared to turn out her light, do you ever miss your old life, before us? James considered the question with the honesty Sophie always deserved. I miss Catherine and Emma every day. That never goes away when you lose someone you love. He sat on the edge of her bed. But do I miss the person I had become after losing them? The way I shut myself away from everything that mattered? Not for a single moment. Sophie nodded, processing this with her characteristic thoughtfulness. I was thinking about the night we came here. I was so scared. But something told me to knock on your door instead of the others we passed. I'm profoundly grateful you did, James said softly. Me too. Sophie's eyes began to drift closed, secure in the safety that had become her new normal. Even in the worst storm, we found each other. James remained beside her until her breathing deepened into sleep, then moved quietly to the window. Outside, snow continued falling, each flake unique, each following its own path to earth, like the journey that had brought these children to his door on a night when all three souls had needed rescue. He had once viewed that snowstorm as nature's random cruelty. Now he recognized it as something else entirely, the catalyst for his redemption, for his second chance at what truly mattered in life. James Mitchell, once defined by wealth and isolation, now measured his fortune differently. In bedtime stories, in hard-won smiles, in the privilege of watching his children heal and grow, in the profound honor of being their protector, their champion, their father. The fiercest storms, he had learned, sometimes carry the greatest blessings. And even in the darkest winter, with the right companions, one could find immeasurable warmth.